Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Sheldon Stromquist. He is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Iowa, and he is the author of the new book, Blaming the City, a global history of workers' fight for municipal socialism. Professor Stromquist, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs.
Very delighted to be here. Yeah.
So the story of the history of socialism is often told as a history of movements in countries. You bring it down to the local level, and you tell us stories that aren't often told. The stories about people who got elected to city councils, the stories about mayors. You tell us a history of socialism that we might not have heard before. In fact, you have a quote from about 1910 from, I think, an Italian socialist saying it's about little struggles, humble battles that would make an outside observer laugh. I kind of loved that quote. So where do we begin the history of municipal socialism? When was it that socialists started infiltrating city government?
Well, there were incidental cases, certainly over the course of the 19th century in different contexts. But I think the story really begins or gains momentum, certainly, and takes on an identity in the 1890s, late 80s, early 90s. And it's really a global phenomenon. And that's one of the reasons that I ended up kind of casting this as a global story, because what's remarkable is that this new kind of politics, this grassroots politics focused on cities and city life, really emerges simultaneously in many, many different countries. I love the term translocal in the sense that it's a kind of counterpoint to transnational. And the emphasis here is that they saw themselves as part of a locally constituted international movement. And they were very much in touch with each other and learning from each other and copying each other's political programs because they fit the local circumstances.
Something quite extraordinary about it is you can look at this at first and think that these socialists are focusing on these little struggles, these things like getting the city power company, municipalizing the utilities and getting the garbage picked up, and things that would seem to have absolutely no global implications. But as you point out, you take us to Germany, you take us to Australia, New Zealand, you take us to Sweden, like this remote mining town in Australia, all of these places where people are kind of doing the same thing. So why?
Why? Well, there are a couple of reasons that I would focus on particularly. And one is that the life in cities in the late 19th century, and we are talking about large cities and smaller cities too, was pretty awful. The conditions were miserable in terms of housing, in terms of sanitation, in terms of epidemic disease that was a byproduct of both of those, in terms of any kind of municipal services that people might hope or expect to have. I mean, even access to bathing, which was not generally part of the accoutrements an ordinary worker's household might have. So they depended on, public baths. But at every turn, they were facing the resistance of these entrenched elites that were used to governing cities in their own interests, keeping taxes down, keeping workers basically silent. And so I think the simultaneity or the similarity of the conditions that workers face in cities of wide variety, but all across the globe, but particularly in those countries that were in the throes of industrializing and where migrants were being drawn or driven from the countryside into cities and finding these horrific conditions. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that, as I said before, these folks are talking to each other. They're reading each other's newspapers. They're traveling, even under 19th century conditions, to observe what's going on in one place or another. They're reading the same pamphlets. They're cobbling together a kind of locally based international movement that was really quite astounding. And I wasn't quite prepared for that when I entered this study. I mean, I've been a historian who focused primarily in the United States. And as I began to dig a little further, I found, whoa, wait, people are talking about Australia, they're talking about Sweden, they're talking about Germany. How do they know this stuff and where is it coming from? And so that international dimension of the movement really struck home and captured my interest. And I wanted to convey that in this book.
Now, socialists who enter city government have to be a particular kind of socialist. There are socialists who are revolutionaries who, agitate for the overthrow of capitalism and the final expropriation of the owning class. But to run for a city council, you have to have, shall we say, a bit of a pragmatic acknowledgement of the limits of what you're going to be able to do. I just want to quote you. You have a quote from socialists in Dayton, Ohio, at one point in the early 1900s, who says, "They do not expect to inaugurate the cooperative commonwealth in the next 2 years. However, they determine to do the very best they can with the degree of political power that has been entrusted to them." So you have to have that kind of practical philosophy, I feel like, to be a municipal socialist.
That's right. But I would want to emphasize in the context of that quote, as well as others, that these people are in the trenches, literally, in city councils, fighting hand-to-hand battles with entrenched elites in both of the major parties in the US. But at the same time, they are very cognizant of this being part of a larger struggle. And that this is where you begin to build socialism, in other words, is at that level. And that they believe very much that the victories they win are going to have an impact on a kind of wider canvas of social change. There's a wonderful quote from a German social democratic city councilor, who said, we go to a party meeting on Sunday and we talk about the revolution and we talk about the transformation of society. And then on Monday, we go to the city council. And in the city council, we're talking about where to put street lighting. And it's that sort of tension between this kind of nitty-gritty, day-to-day struggle to make life better for workers, and this kind of wider social vision that what we're really about is transforming society and winning power for the working class. There's a lot of variation. Some people are more wrapped up in that larger struggle. Other people are more consumed by the day-to-day nitty-gritty fights over street lighting. But there's that interesting tension, I think, within the movement. And it's productive, in my view, in this period that I've been intensively looking at, the late 19th to through the first several decades of the 20th century. It's productive of very material changes in the lives of workers. And I like to say that what we see around us in cities, even though there are tremendous problems that we still have to contend with, and entrenched neoliberal elites who still want to roll back the public sector, life is incredibly better compared to what these folks in the late 19th and early 20th century were struggling to achieve.
Yeah, I feel like there's the view of progress that Steven Pinker has kind of become infamous for, which is that, why don't you appreciate how good life is, how wonderful everything is? But I always just detest that. But it is true that we also have to recognize that many of the good things that we have today are because people a century ago worked under incredibly brutal and difficult conditions to make it so that we wouldn't have to suffer the way that they did.
Right. And I think we do take for granted, to some degree, a public sector in cities that is pretty robust. There's a lot of variation from one city to another. But, we can count on garbage collection. We can count on sewers that will carry waste into treatment plants where it's taken care of. We can count on water that, for the most part, not in Flint and not in Jackson, Mississippi, but in most places, water that is drinkable and is safe. We can count on public transit. We can count on parks, having parks and libraries. Yeah. We can count on public schools. There's just a whole range of things that these folks that I'm talking about in the late 19th and early 20th century could not take for granted. In fact, they didn't exist until they fought for them and finally made them a reality. So it's a battle, but I don't want to underestimate the continuing nature of that battle in today's world. There's an old movie that the Amalgamated Clothing Workers made, and there's a refrain in that movie about the history of the labor movement in which it says every generation's got to do it again. And there's a certain sense in which, even though we can chart real progress, we also know that in some sense, these battles are never finally won.
Right.
And the attempts, to privatize public service, or the attempts to attack and undo public sector unions. This was one of the big demands that these municipal socialists were making in the late 19th and early 20th century. We want public workers, the people who collect the garbage, to be paid a union wage. And we want them to work 8 hours a day. And why do we want that? Well, we want it for their sake, but we also want to set a standard so that private employers, if they want workers, they're going to have to try to match the standards that the public sector is establishing. And so today in Iowa and in Wisconsin and in numbers of states, that attack on public sector unions is absolutely central to the attempt to roll back what this history has given us as a legacy.
Yeah, in having to do it again, it can be inspiring to look at those who have done it before, and also incredibly helpful because we can learn lessons from where they both succeeded and failed. To that end, I had another quote for the Dayton, Ohio Socialists from their municipal platform when they said, while we realize that a socialist victory at Dayton will not enable us to establish socialism, nevertheless, we pledge ourselves entrusted with political power to apply this principle of collective ownership and democratic management in city affairs so far as practicable under the new charter and the capitalistic laws. Can you tell us how, obviously you're examining socialists around the world, so there's not one answer, there are many answers to the question, but can you tell us some of the ways in which these municipal socialists tried to do that, to apply the principle of collective ownership and democratic management on the city level?
Well, we've already kind of touched in passing on public utilities, and those were important in their own right because in many cases, privately owned water systems and electrical companies and especially streetcars were poorly managed. They gave very poor service and created conditions that were dangerous or unlivable. But municipalizing those utilities created a kind of model for what collective ownership might actually look like. And in many, many of these cases where they succeeded, they established public utilities that were well run, that created a surplus that was then funneled back into the treasuries of cities to provide more services to workers and other residents. That sense of you're not socializing the whole economy, but you're socializing a particular segment of the economy that has a real impact on people's lives and that serves as a kind of model for what collective or cooperative ownership might actually do. Again, connecting the kind of larger vision to the practical day-to-day issues of daily life. This is emblematic of that. And it's really kind of at the heart of what this movement is about. These are very idealistic and deeply committed people. You don't go to city council meetings, that last through the night or well into the night, day after day after day, without having a pretty deep commitment. There's a wonderful case, and you may have encountered him in the book, of a guy named Edward Hartley from Bradford, England. And Hartley was a master butcher by trade, but, was very cognizant of the need for taking hold of the city and making it a better place to live. And so he ran for city council. He got defeated several times and kept coming back and finally got elected. And then for our benefit, I'm not sure what his motivation was exactly, except that he thought he was doing something important. He kept a diary for 1 year of his activity as a city councilor. And it's a really enlightening kind of glimpse of what this work was like for somebody coming out of the working class, going into city council and having to contend with these established elites who were used to running things their way and who didn't take them seriously, didn't take these socialists seriously, and tried to undercut their ability to do anything effective at every turn. And so his diary is just replete with these descriptions of his efforts in city council meetings to try to get something done. And a lot of it is just frustrating, but he wins small battles. And at times it's a very funny account of his time in city council.
Yeah, so you say here that he proved to be a thorn in the sides of both his liberal and conservative fellow councillors and irritated his fellow councillors with his blunt and contentious manner.
He would say to them, particularly his quote, liberal, which is not liberal, but it's conservative, and Tory opponents, he would say to them, you spend less time in the bar, which was part of, attached to the city council chambers. If you'd spend less time in the bar, you might get something effective done here. And there was one point in which one of his opponents, a Tory opponent, was really just going after him with everything. And he stood up and laughed and said, I think the problem here is that he must have sat in my chair because he's behaving like I do. It's just a free-for-all in many cases. And yet what's remarkable, a lot of historians just haven't really been that interested in looking and reading through city council minutes and saying, well, what's going on here? But as I began to kind of reconstruct what's going on through the kind of very tame account that's in city council minutes, these guys were very astute and effective. They learned how to maneuver, how to build a kind of working coalition around one issue or another. And even as a small minority in the city council, these social democrats somehow managed to kind of get some modest victories. And then later, when they really had a majority or a near majority and could actually pull together the votes needed to pass major ordinances, then they really got major things done.
Well, maybe you could give us an example of municipal socialists actually succeeding in. I feel like we often, as socialists, are so depressed by the history of socialism as a history of failure after failure.
Yeah. Well, my favorite place in this whole book is a place called Broken Hill, New South Wales. And this is a silver mining town in the remote outback of New South Wales. When I went there, I was actually working in Melbourne doing research and had a rental car. And I said, I got to get to Broken Hill. Everybody's talking about Broken Hill. So I got in the car. I had to drive for 2 straight days, 12-hour days, through the outback to find this place. I spent a couple of days there doing research and talking to people, and then had to drive another 2 days to Sydney to get there. So
this is remote.
This is indeed remote, the definition of remote. And they were mostly guys in this case. I'm not finding much evidence of women's involvement in Broken Hill. That's not the case in a lot of places where women are actually playing a very important role. But in Broken Hill, they're able to begin to elect 1 and then 2 and then 3 more city councilors in the 1890s. By 1900, they have a majority and they're able to elect a mayor. And from then on, this is a labor-governed town. And they do amazing things. They build public baths and they hire street repair with public workers, and they revolutionize the sewer system and water system. And they're just marching ahead. And it's not without resistance, but in an isolated mining town like that, where there's a really palpable sense of class consciousness, they're able to sustain their control of that city down to the present. That's the most clear-cut example. In the United States, of course, a lot of people look to Milwaukee as the kind of beacon of municipal socialism. And there's a lot to be said for that. In 1910, and again, I think this hasn't been as well documented as it might have been, but after winning, again, piecemeal victories and accumulating greater strength, they're able to elect a majority of city council and to elect a mayor in 1910. And, Milwaukee's a pretty large city by American standards and even by world standards, too. And so this is a kind of beacon that shines around the world, and people are talking about Milwaukee and what the socialists are doing there. And again, it's a very similar program. I mean, it's public ownership. It's hiring workers to work as public workers for the city. It's just kind of altering the fabric of daily life for workers in pretty dramatic ways. And the Milwaukee case is instructive for all kinds of ways. But like many other cases, after 2 years in office, they face a challenge by Democratic and Republican candidates who decide to join forces and have one candidate rather than 2 running against the socialists, and they get booted out. But they come back 2 years later, and socialist governance in Milwaukee ebbs and flows, but is a significant factor in the political life of that city, really until the 1960s. There's a socialist mayor in Milwaukee from 1948 to 1960, Frank Zeidler. It's a well-established tradition, but
be a socialist in the 50s and succeed in remaining in office is pretty impressive.
Right. So this is a deep-rooted phenomenon in Milwaukee and in other cities as well. But those are two cases. Yeah.
Well, because I had heard about the Milwaukee case, because as you say, it became a little bit famous, but you excavate other examples from the United States that are interesting, because you're interested in going smaller. I mean, I didn't know that there was a pretty robust Ohio socialism, for example. I read a couple of things from Dayton. I had no idea I ever had socialists.
Right. Well, in Hamilton and literally scores of other towns in Ohio elected, at least for a period of time, socialist governments that were kind of cut out of the same fabric as what I've been talking about. But by today's Ohio standards, that's a tradition that's long gone, except that, again, I would argue that the fabric of urban life is different because of what those socialist governments did. You know, the United States is often thought of as an outlier in the history of socialism. There's a famous sociological tract by a German social democrat who came to the United States and asked the question, why is there no socialism in the United States? And of course, what he was talking about was the absence of a robust national party that could contend for power in the way the social democrats in Germany were doing. But his name was Werner Sombart. And he had all kinds of explanations for why this might be the case. But what he failed to look at, and what I think is really important, as you might guess, is that at a local level, there was, in fact, a lot of socialism. And it's kind of woven into the fabric of communities across the country.
Yeah, his question was kind of the wrong question. It should have been, why is there no large socialist national labor party in the United States? Because, as you say, at that very time, I think he wrote that in 1906, that time, you know, socialism was bubbling up in all these places. There was a fascinating story of all these cities and towns having, of course, this is all completely forgotten. I suppose that one thing about it is you talked about how Milwaukee managed to have socialist governance into the 1960s, but for the most part, you're writing about a golden age that kind of starts in the 1890s and ends around World War I. So why does it all come to a crashing end?
Well, here I think the story in the United States really does diverge from the other countries that I'm talking about. Somewhat complicated story, but the socialist movement in the United States during World War I was really crushed by a kind of alliance of the federal government, the Wilson administration, and local elites who were determined to root out what remained of this movement. And so Socialist Party offices were sacked, socialists were hounded, their publications were prevented from being mailed or closed down altogether. There was a very extreme repression of the Socialist Party in the United States that had a direct impact on these local levels. And at the end of the war, the Red Scare, which was kind of conjured up in 1919 and 1920, really kind of scattered the remnants of the movement and people went underground. There was a real dearth of a public presence of a viable socialist party that could contest for power in most localities. Now, that's not true everywhere, but it's true in many. And whereas in the rest of the world that I'm looking at, the World War I really kind of brought a degree of access to the democratic franchise in cities that had been largely absent in the pre-war years, or it had been very circumscribed. And so these movements, in the context of the war, but especially after the war, really kind of move forward and claim even more strength. And again, there are certain examples that highlight this. And the one that I use in the book and give a good deal of attention to is what came to be called Red Vienna. You know, in the aftermath of World War I, Vienna was like most Austrian cities and towns, and also most German cities and towns, in disarray and the tremendous hardship, food shortages, you know. And in that context, in part because of the constitutional revolution that happened and the expanding of the franchise, socialists were able to win power in Vienna. And for the next 14 years, were able to govern that city as a kind of, like Milwaukee in its own time, as a kind of model for what socialists could do when they gained power. And in Vienna, it was really remarkable. And, you know, again, this kind of international network of municipal socialists was paying a lot of attention to Red Vienna, because this then was another example of this is what we can do if we win power. And this is the way we can change everyday lives of workers as a result of the kind of things we can do in city government.
Well, yeah, so tell us about that Red Vienna as a model. What did they manage to do there?
Well, there are many dimensions to this story, but one of them is that the city, because of the constitutional changes at the end of the war, became a self-governing state in its own right, in the way that Berlin is a state in its own right. And as a state, it was able to, under the Constitution, to institute tax reform to a degree that a city within a larger state was not able to do. Once they elected the Social Democrats, set about transforming the tax structure in a way that shifted the burden to the wealthy and cut taxes on the working class and created a fund, a substantial fund, that could be used to build public housing, to build public baths, to change the infrastructure of the city in pretty fundamental ways. But the tax reform was crucial. You may have encountered it in the book, but there's a wonderful quote. It's actually from an Australian journal about Red Vienna. And it's indicative, one, of the attention that the world was giving to Red Vienna, but also of this key element in the change that came to Vienna. If I can just read it quickly. Quote, this is the Australian worker that's writing in 1925. The socialists most hated in Vienna by the well-to-do is certainly Hugo Breitner. Speak to them of Lenin, Trotsky, or Liebknecht, and they will listen with perfect calm. But mention the name Breitner, and the calm is replaced by fury and hate. He is credited with the intention of destroying the whole of economic life in Vienna. In reality, he is merely the author of the financial policy of the municipal council. Breitner's new tax scheme introduces some 18 new taxes, which chiefly hit those who can afford to pay, and abolishes one or two old taxes, which burden workers unfairly. For instance, the house tax and various taxes on food. You can imagine people saying, oh, well, Lenin, Trotsky, Liebknecht, that's fine. That's not a problem. But Breitner, this is somebody who's hitting close to home. So that tax reform was key. And the socialists continued to march forward. But the remnants of that housing program are still visible in Vienna today if you visit. And Karl Marx Hof is still there, being one of the major kind of public housing things that were created. But this was housing that was decent compared to the old, decrepit housing that workers were living in pre-war.
As I was reading your book, I felt, on the one hand, I kept feeling, wow, all of these great unsung, unwritten about socialists proved that you can do a great deal actually in city government, that it does matter, that you can make real gains for people, that we as socialists should pay attention to the history of city governments and that we should think about what can be done with city governments. And then also the other feeling that I kept having, because as I say, in the United States, socialism was crushed essentially outside Milwaukee. And of course, Red Vienna, Austria falls to the Nazis. So an important lesson there is that you can do a great deal in cities, but unless you have a strong socialist movement at the level of the nation state, your wonderful socialism in one city experiment can be crushed from without.
Yes, and that's certainly true. And the case of the Paris Commune that I opened the book with and Red Vienna that I kind of closed the book with, in some ways, both are instructive examples of what municipal socialism could mean, but also examples of the way in which it was vulnerable to state power. There's no question that you can't govern in total isolation. And in the United States today, I mean, we're feeling this, in Iowa, but lots of other places as well. The inability of cities to control their own destinies in the face of state governments that want to prevent them from doing things they want to do makes this kind of progress pretty difficult. So we have to be attentive to politics at the higher levels as well. But that higher level politics, if it's not grounded in vibrant kind of municipal movements, is also hard to marshal. There's work at all levels. I want people to think about the fact that not just in Milwaukee, but, Chicago just elected a new mayor. There's great hope for. And there are cities around the country. Jackson, Mississippi is another example where within the constraints that states impose on cities, there's still a lot that can be done. And we have to remember that some of what we're living with in terms of the quality of city life is a byproduct of this workers' struggles of an earlier era. It's ongoing, but I still think that these cases in the early 20th century can be held up as an example of what's possible to achieve.
Yeah, that's right. You did mention the Paris Commune there, and that fits into your story. It predates the municipal socialist experiments that you're talking about for the most part, but you do talk about it because it's got an important place in the socialist imagination. Everyone talks about it, and it's inspired by the Paris Commune. So for our listeners who are unfamiliar, perhaps you could remind us of what the Paris Commune was and tell us why it has proved such an enduring inspiration to all kinds of socialists, but in particular where it fits into this story of municipal socialism.
Yeah. Well, Paris workers had a long history of periodic insurrection. And in part, it's building on that and an ongoing struggle against elites' attempts to reconstruct and govern the city in their own interests. But in 1871, the French had been largely defeated by the Prussian military, and Paris was surrounded. And the elites basically fled the city. And for a brief period of time, workers constituting themselves in local militia and local organizations not only defended Paris against the Germans, but also essentially rooted out the remnants of elite rule for a very brief period of time. And so from March to the end of May of 1871, Paris workers set about the challenge of constructing local government that was responsive to their needs and was democratic. And there were a lot of important experiments that were tried, but it was in the context of a city that was surrounded and of a elite that had sought refuge in Versailles, but was mobilizing to crush this experiment in short order. And of course, the crushing is an understatement. I mean, literally tens of thousands of people, Parisian workers, died within the space of 2 to 3 weeks in late May, defending this city that they had come to control and to govern. And so the Paris Commune emerges as a kind of beacon of an attempt by workers to take control of their lives in a major city and to govern in their own interests and undo the power of elites to control them. And it becomes iconic. I mean, there are yearly and then very frequent demonstrations around the world recalling the memory of the Paris Commune and pointing to it as an example of what workers could do if they won power. So like Red Vienna, like Milwaukee in its own way, it becomes a kind of global icon that in the imagination of socialists, that's very important. And it stays there literally for decades.
Just to conclude here, I think one of the impressions people will get, you mentioned earlier having to refight the same fights over and over. I think people are really going to feel a sense of recognition and familiarity. You really bring history alive, and we see ourselves in some of these people. It struck me when I was reading the agenda from one of the Swedish socialists, because you read about Sweden in the book, and the municipal agenda is private contractors should not be used for public works, the 8-hour day, standard wages for city employees, take decisive measures against unemployment, municipalize tramways and the city market, city to provide food for impoverished school children, appointment of a city official under the direction of the unions to provide assistance to the poor, heated cottages for the unemployed, improvements to make the sewer system hygienic, free clinic for tuberculosis patients, and full sympathy for miners' strikes and shoemaker strikes. Yeah, the fight goes on, doesn't it?
Yeah, right. And, every one of these programs, although they have a great deal in common with each other, there are always kind of interesting little quirks that they put in that reflect local conditions. In Milwaukee, one of the demands that the socialists put forward was free concerts in the park for workers in working class neighborhoods, and milk for school children, and just a whole range of very particular demands woven into these kind of broader demands that were pretty consistent across cities for sewage and water and electricity and streetcars and whatever.
Well, the whole story is so rich, we only have time today to truly scratch the surface. So people are going to, if they want more on all of these various municipal socialisms, this trans-local movement that took hold and achieved some great things and that we can learn a lot from, they are going to need to pick up the book, Claiming the City, A Global History of Workers' Fight for Municipal Socialism, available now from Verso by Sheldon Stromquist. Professor Stromquist, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Very enjoyable. Thanks very much for the conversation.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.